Let's get started. Settle down. Okay, so today's lecture is about cryptoeconomics, and what you're going to learn is cryptoeconomics is not really anything new. So we're going to do, obviously, definitions, apply it to some of the systems that we know, including a simple game design, and then a lot of it is going to be review, and then we're going to talk about proof of work and proof of stake. So, cool stuff. So let's start by talking about a very simple game design. So you'll find that a lot of things in life can be modeled as a game. So you can define a game as any kind of interaction where you have multiple actors and they have some set of actions that they are able to do within the rules of the game, and it's restricted in some amount. And each action in combination with other actors' actions are going to lead to an outcome for that actor. And when we study games like these, there's many different types, of course. That's called game theory, is basically looking at the different strategies that each individual can come up with to maximize their own outcome. And obviously, this depends on the other player strategies as well. So some examples of games, very classic examples are like chess and mahjong and other board games. League of Legends is also obviously a game, and you can also apply game theory to that. But you can also apply game theory to broader things like wars and elections, and any interaction in which you have a limited set of actions that lead to an outcome, and you can come up with a strategy for it. All right, so I have a game design in mind. So since it's midterm season, I had this in mind when I was making this lecture. So let's say we have a class with 500 students, and we're all going to take a midterm that's worth 30% of our grade. So what's at stake here is our grade. We as students, as participants in the game, want to get a high score on the midterm so that our grades will be higher, right? And the teacher who is designing this game wants all the students to learn the material. So are we able to actually design a course policy such that we can align incentives so that students that work to benefit their own self-interest and get their own optimum outcome are actually going to benefit what the teachers want, which is everyone learning the material. So do we think this is possible, first of all? As students. Raise your hand if you think it's possible. In an ideal world, of course, this is possible. So let's say in the most simplest case, just don't think of all of the extra things that can happen. We have students wanting to get a high score and teachers wanting people to learn material. So they have a new midterm rule. If you study in a group, you will get extra points on the midterm. And the way we implement that is we have a new set of rules where in your midterm, you're going to bring a picture along with you that has you and your study group together, and you'll get points awarded for every student in the picture. So the idea is the more people in the picture, the more points that you get. So the idea is students will study in groups because they want to get these extra points on the midterm using this study group picture. And so this outcome that they get is higher scores. And for the teachers, they also achieve their goal because everyone studies together and is able to learn from each other and overall understand the material a little bit better. So this is obviously an ideal situation, but just think of it in the most simplest sense. So what happened here is incentive alignment. And we are able to ensure that these actually match up through the integrity of photographs, right? We are relying on photographic evidence to be proof that students actually study together. Obviously, from a photograph, you can't tell the quality of what they studied or how much time they spent, yada, yada, yada. But if you were relying on this being a accurate or, satisfactory proof for that, this would be effective, right? And through our understandings of students' motivations, while we were designing this course policy system, we were able to align the incentives to get both things to come out right. So that's kind of the idea behind these game designs. Any questions? It's a very simple example. I don't know, I would like this policy, honestly. So next I'm going to talk about cryptoeconomics. So who here actually has heard of cryptoeconomics? You've heard the term before, used in passing. Does anyone want to take a shot at defining the term for me? Anybody? What is cryptoeconomics? What do you think it is? What have you heard it used in a sentence as? Well, yes.
I'd say it's like using that kind of incentive
Yes, yes. So what Kate said was you're using incentive alignment in the scope of crypto. And that's very, very true. Anyone else have any other answers? No? Okay. So the way I define cryptoeconomics and the way I want you to understand it is it's an application of economics to design and distributed systems that aligns incentives. That's the biggest part, is aligning incentives, so that users acting in self-interest benefit the system as well. And so the crypto part comes from the fact that we are using cryptography for security and enforcing the rules of this game that we're designing. And we use econ, using economic incentives, to design the rules in such a way to get our desired outcome. So this is similar to mechanism design, which is called reverse game theory. So what I just talked about was, if you are looking at a game, how would you analyze the different strategies? So in this case, in mechanism design, you're actually looking at the outcomes that you want and then designing the game to fit those outcomes. So this is very similar to mechanism design, but we're usually talking about things like cryptocurrencies and distributed systems when we're talking about cryptoeconomics. What I don't want you to think cryptoeconomics is, the intersection between cryptography and economics. Sure, it borrows from both of these fields of study, but it's more of an application or a practical science than it is like studying these two fields together. It is borrowing from both, but don't think of it as this plus that. That makes sense to people? Are there any questions on the definition itself? Okay, happy about that. So now I'm going to talk about the crypto part and the economics part. So cryptography is used to enforce the rules of the game. So it defines the boundaries within the actors can act. Is that a correct sentence? Anyways, so for example, in Pac-Man, you can only go up, down, left, right. Those are the boundaries of what can happen. And so if you are following the rules that are available to you, these 4 different arrow keys, you are following the rules of the game. In tic-tac-toe, it's even more simple. You only have 9 spaces that you can put stuff in, and you have to go in alternating order. And so basically, because of these rules, we can define these set of actions for the players to act. And if they follow whatever design that we are making for them, we're going to get the desired outcome. So kind of cryptography is used to enforce the rules of the game. And then the Minecraft example is, in Minecraft, you only get building blocks that are like cube-shaped. So you're very limited into what you can do. Obviously, this hasn't like stopped builders in Minecraft from building amazing things, but the idea is you have rules that define what is possible for actors to do. And that limits what their outcomes can be. All right. So in the simple midterm game design example that I use, we are relying on the integrity of photographs. Obviously, this is not a cryptographic technique, but because of the integrity of photographs, when we see a picture, we trust that it is depicting something that actually happened. We can say that a photo of students in Moffitt is proof that these students studied together. So we're relying on these rules to enforce that, yes, if we do this, then that is going to happen. So these are kind of assumptions that we're making. Some cryptographic techniques include cryptographic hash functions. So for example, in Bitcoin, when we compare 2 hashes and they're the same, then we can trust that the data was identical. And this is stemming from all of the properties of cryptographic hash functions that we discussed many lectures ago. And because cryptographic properties like these have been proved, we can rely on them to build designs off of. So another example is in cryptographic hash functions, let's say a mismatched Merkle root does not match what we had before in our own block, then we know the transaction was tampered with. So we can use this as a way to kind of extract or abstract, actually. Because this happened, we don't have to worry about what goes on behind the scenes. We just know that we can rely on this to work. Another example is private and public key cryptography. So if we see Alice's signature on a message, using her public key and the message, we can see that this message did indeed originate from Alice, or the owner of this private key that matches with the public key. And we can rely on these cryptographic principles, like I said. This is really nice. Now we come to the economics portion. So economic incentives are used to get players to play a certain way. And these incentives can be rewards or punishments. So for example, if you play the Kim Kardashian game, you can get really addicted because there's all these fucking dresses and shirts and jewelry that you can earn from doing stupid things, but because they're incentivizing you with all these like rewards, you're incentivized to keep playing. In a normal traffic law abiding city, you are punished if you don't drive in your lane and abide by the speed limit and not crash into things. But in GTA, there are apparently different incentives that may incentivize you to not exactly drive in the most lawful way. So there's rewards and punishments that can motivate behavior. So for example, in the midterm game design that I mentioned, we could add more rewards. So if maybe you were the one who initiated the study group, maybe you could get more points. If you are sabotaging your study group and creating false midterm study guides, maybe you get punished for that. Basically, you want to incentivize good behavior and disincentivize bad behavior. And so you have a positive and negative kind of way to tinker with that. That makes sense to everybody? All right. And so what we've seen from the example that I had before is the main motivation that we're relying on is students want good grades. And we can see that this motivation is so powerful that it can cause people to avoid stepping on certain things or roll down hills and stuff. And so what we want is economic incentives so that if students study together, they will get good grades. And so positive reinforcement of that behavior. In Bitcoin, the most obvious one is mining rewards. So we want miners to create blocks, which benefits the system, but it also benefits them because miners get money in the form of mining rewards and transaction fees. So are there any questions on what cryptoeconomics is, how cryptography and economics fit in? This is not a very technical lecture, so if you want to just discuss something, that works too. Cool. I'll just move on then. All right. So let's apply cryptoeconomics to proof of work, or Bitcoin actually. So I have a clicker question for you. We all know that Bitcoin revolutionized the concept of currency. It was this big new thing. There were other tries that happened before, but Bitcoin was the first to succeed. So what new concept did Satoshi Nakamoto really introduce? Was it the concept of digital currency? Was it using proof of work to mint coins? Was it using public and private key cryptography? Was it using Merkle trees and hash pointers to store data? Or none of the above? You want to discuss amongst yourselves and then come up with an answer, please. Okay. So who thinks that digital currency was a new concept that Satoshi Nakamoto introduced? Okay, can anyone think of an example that precedes Bitcoin of a digital currency? This should be pretty easy. Yes. DigiCash, right? And I'm sure like US dollars were also in digital form before this too. And who thinks proof of work for minting coins was a new concept introduced by Satoshi Nakamoto? All right. So some people think it's new. Can anyone actually think of an example of maybe another implementation of this before Bitcoin? Anyone think back to lecture 2? Yes. Hashcash, right? So Hashcash actually used a hash puzzle to mint new coins, and that was their way of limiting the supply of money that was made. All right. So who thinks that public and private key cryptography was a new concept introduced by Satoshi Nakamoto? Okay, I'm really glad that no one has their hands raised. Can anyone tell me where this idea originated from? Or an implementation of public and private key cryptography that precedes Bitcoin? All right, yes. RSA is, exactly. And who thinks that Merkle trees and hash pointers to store data was a new concept introduced by Satoshi Nakamoto? All right, nobody fell into my trap. Okay, so I'm not sure exactly when Merkle trees were introduced, but maybe if anyone else knows. Okay, yeah, so that was not actually, none of these things were actually new concepts by Satoshi Nakamoto. He did borrow from a lot of other papers and implementations of digital currencies and not as successful cryptocurrencies, but there is brilliance in Satoshi's design, and it's in Bitcoin's economic design. So the thing about Bitcoin is we have this pseudonymous, anonymous network of peer-to-peer distributed nodes in this distributed network where you don't know what the identity of the person that you're connected with is. You probably don't know the vast majority of the nodes in the Bitcoin system, and so no one actually trusts each other in this system. You all have an incentive to steal from each other because this person is not your friend, this is not your family, you don't care about them, you should just be acting in your own self-interest, just like in almost every other situation in life. And some people might actually try to destroy this system. We are assuming that there are adversaries within a distributed network like this. So can you see why it would be challenging to design a system that works given these restrictions, right? So that's why it's so hard to create a cryptocurrency, a truly decentralized cryptocurrency. And so when we're designing Bitcoin, or not when Satoshi or whoever it is, Bitcoin wants, a Bitcoin user, when you're creating this for the typical user, you want a trustworthy currency system. Otherwise, no one would participate in this network, of course. They want to keep their identity private, right? That was a cypherpunk ideal that we wanted when we were creating a cryptocurrency back then. And sometimes a Bitcoin user is going to want to destroy the network. But most of all, the average person, no matter who they are, we can assume that they want their economic value to them in the system to be greater than their economic cost. This could be earning money, earning value in other ways, such as maybe being able to buy and sell tangible items or goods or services with this currency that they have in Bitcoin. Maybe they want to earn money off of trading Bitcoin. Whatever it is, their cost should not exceed the value that they are getting from this system. Otherwise, they would not be incentivized to participate. And this is going to be really key when we're designing incentives. What Bitcoin wants, what is best for the network or the system is an accurate, non-corruptible ledger of transactions, right? We want to make sure that transactions that happen on the network are not going to be changed in the future. It should be tamper-resistant or tamper-evident or tamper-proof, whatever wording of that works for you. We want to make sure that once something has been committed, sometime in the future, it cannot be reverted. We want a live network that allows users to transact regularly. So if I submit a transaction to this network, there is no centralized authority to just say, yeah, I'm going to do it for you. We cannot be waiting for hours and hours or days or whatever. Sometimes even minutes is too long for us to wait for a transaction to go through. So this network needs to be available in live. And what Bitcoin doesn't want, and what we want to keep in mind when we're designing incentives, is we don't want denial of service attacks, such as miners uploading empty blocks or users uploading spam transactions to kind of clog up the network and make it unusable. So we want all of these things when we're designing a network. So how can we translate these users' interests into the interests of the network? I feel like some of you probably already have some answers, right? So let's look at how we do this. All right. So remember the goal of Bitcoin, what Bitcoin wants. It doesn't have any wants or whatever, but this is what we want when we're designing it, is an accurate, non-corruptible ledger of transactions and a live network where you can transact regularly. So what do we need nodes in the network? What do we need people to do in order to achieve these goals? Does anyone have any answers to this question? So this is like a team effort. So what is like something we need everyone to do in order to make this happen? All right, discussion TAs, like please engage in some conversation. I want to hear some answers from you guys. All right. Okay, let's bring it back before things get off topic. So what are some answers that we came up with? What do people need to do to achieve these goals? Host a node. We need people to host nodes, exactly. What else? Yeah, we need to check for transaction accuracy, exactly. And some of these things, we don't actually need to trust people to do it, but maybe we can enforce rules in the system using cryptography to make sure that certain actions cannot be done, such as faulty transactions or spending money you don't have, changing the blockchain, for example. So what else do we need people to do? So in order for transactions to be happening regularly and being uploaded to this data structure that we have, what do we need people to do? That might be an easier question. Yeah. Yeah, so people need to frequently use the platform, and what exactly do they have to do while they're using it? Sorry? Yeah, so they have to make transactions, and they have to agree on what transactions are correct. Okay. All right, so maybe we can continue now. I'm kind of satisfied. So nodes have to store their data securely. Data shouldn't be able to be changed, and that is something that we can just ensure using cryptography. But things that we need to rely on people to do is we need to have multiple nodes storing multiple copies so that we can kind of spread out the say and what data is correct amongst as many people as possible so that there's no centralization going on. The more decentralized it is, the better that we think it is because there's no one person controlling it. That's what we want, so we need multiple nodes to be hosted by multiple people. And the data needs to be updated regularly. So what happens here if you're hosting a node is you actually need to listen for transactions. You need to accept those transactions and make sure that they are not faulty, that people are spending the money that they do have and only once. Nodes should publish blocks with meaningful data. So this system would not work if transactions were trying to be sent, but the people hosting the nodes were not actually including them in blocks. So when you create a block, it shouldn't be empty. You should be incentivized to actually put transactions in there. So this graphic would be like, you have a bunch of empty blocks, and the guy is like, where's my transaction though? And last but not least, the data needs to be agreed upon by everyone. And so this is a democratic democratic system where we all want to agree and come to consensus. And so we have a consensus protocol to ensure that, but people still need to participate in it. So we have these, I think, 3 or 4 things that we need people to actually do. The rest can be handled by the rules of the game that we can set up. And actually these things that we require people to do are not cheap. They actually cost money. To host a node, you need to have a computer, you need to have your electricity bill, because you're running this computer constantly. You have to be listening for transactions all the time, and you might even have to mine blocks, so solve cryptographic hash puzzles. So this is not expensive, or this is expensive, and so you incur some economic cost here. And if you remember what I said before, you want your economic benefit to exceed your cost. And so in order to get people to actually do this, we need to give them benefits or economic value for doing these tasks for the network. And so I have another clicker question for you before we actually get into how Bitcoin incentivizes people. So true or false, the inputs of a transaction is always equal to the outputs, or the value of the inputs and the value of the outputs. Is this true? Is this false? How many people think it is true? They're always the same. Okay, maybe we should think about it for a second. So there are several cases, right? Maybe the inputs is greater than the outputs, or maybe the inputs is less than the outputs, or maybe the inputs is always equal to the outputs. So do you think it's possible for the outputs to be greater than the inputs? No, right? Okay, so that's out of the question. So what about them being equal? That's possible, right? But what about less? Do you think it's possible for the inputs to be greater than the outputs? The question is like, where does the money go, right? So how many people think that is true, that the inputs are always equal to the outputs? All right. And how many people think it's false? So if one of you could please explain why it's false.
Yes.
Yeah, guess. Oh, gas?
Yes.
Oh, gas. So in Bitcoin, gas doesn't exist. But I think in the case of, sorry?
Transaction cost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so transaction cost, transaction fee, maybe, is what you're looking for. Yeah, so if you remember, sometimes you actually pay the miner a transaction fee for putting your transaction in their block. So to make this clear, the answer to this question is actually, it is false. They're not always equal, because sometimes you can have outputs that are less than your inputs, and the rest of the money actually goes to the miner of the block. Yeah, so in terms of how the transaction is represented, in terms of like, how it is, the data actually put into the block, technically the inputs and the outputs are different. You can think of it in like a conceptual sense, that the amount of money that you're spending, all of it is going to somebody. So in that sense, yes, the inputs and the outputs are the same. But just in the case of the technicalities of it, yeah. Yes? Yeah, exactly. And so same thing with newly minted Bitcoin, is the input is 0. Okay, yeah. So I guess inputs can be greater than outputs can be greater than inputs sometimes, because you're outputting the mining reward to the miner of the block, and it actually doesn't come from any address. So that is actually correct. Oops. Yeah. So there are special cases. Everybody understand this? Any questions? We're all aware that this is false. Mm-hmm. The input's greater than the output. Okay, so basically when you are creating a transaction, you're going to use your own UTXOs that belong to you. You use your private key to unlock those UTXOs, and then you specify certain amounts of outputs that go to whatever Bitcoin addresses that you're sending it to. And so the amount of Bitcoin that you are unlocking is not always equal to the amount of Bitcoin that you're actually sending out. So let's say I have a UTXO that contains 5 Bitcoin. I send 4 to you, and then I just don't specify where the rest of the Bitcoin goes to. And it is implicitly said that it's going to go to the miner of the block. It's implicit, yeah. Cool. We're going to move on. All right. So to maintain the ledger, we have mining rewards to incentivize block creation and transaction fees to incentivize inclusion of transactions. So if we only had mining rewards, you could have miners actually just publish empty blocks. They wouldn't be incentivized to include transactions. Obviously, this would be kind of stupid, and it wouldn't benefit the network and not really benefit the miner themselves either. But we want to include incentives to have them actually include all these transactions. And transaction fees actually serve another purpose that I'll get to very quickly. If we only had transaction fees, maybe that would work too, right? If we didn't have any mining rewards. Like we said, the Bitcoin mining reward is actually slowly decreasing and converging to 0. So at some point, transaction fees are going to be the only incentive to create blocks. And so another way that transaction fees work with incentive alignment is they disincentivize spamming the network with microtransactions. So let me paint the picture for you. If you had 1 Bitcoin, that can be split into 10 million Bitcoin, not 10 million Bitcoin, but 10 million units of 0.601 Bitcoin, and that can equal to 10 million transactions. So if you want, you could send 10 million transactions whenever you want, because you could just send it back to yourself and do it all over again. So in a world where miners have to include every transaction, this would suck for the network and clog it up. But because you have to include transaction fees in order for miners to include your transaction in the block, there's no reason why you would do this, because you would just be spitting nonsense out into the world that nobody really cares about. So this is also a penalty or disincentivization technique that is used. All right. And so transactions cost money in order to compensate the network. So, you know, we've always said, like, Bitcoin has no transaction fees. It's free to send however much money you want across the world. International payments can be done for free. Obviously, this is in a world where miners are doing things out of the goodness of their hearts. And maybe this was possible back in the early days when not many people were using Bitcoin, and so there was not much competition for space in the blocks. But now, if you don't really include transaction fees within your transaction, the chances of your transaction being included in a block are quite low, or at least in a timely manner, are quite low. Yeah. So we see the two incentives that are used in Bitcoin in order to increase that economic value to people. Yeah. Or in this case, it's actually increasing the cost. Okay. All right. And now we're going to go into the cryptography portion of why Bitcoin works as an application of cryptoeconomics. So this is going to be a lot of review. So who remembers what makes a transaction valid? You want to just read off the slide, maybe? Okay, I just started. Okay, so in order for a transaction to be valid, you need to have a proof of ownership, show a signature. So we have private and public key cryptography that ensures you have exclusive possessions of funds. There's no way to access funds that belong to a certain person unless you have that private key. And you have to have available funds. So Obviously, you can only spend UTXOs that belong to you and you can unlock with your private key. So you cannot spend funds that are not available to you. And there are no other transactions using these funds. So this responsibility relies on the miner or the person creating the block to make sure that there are no conflicting transactions. And of course, if we relied on people to be honest and not do this all on their own, if we had no cryptographic ways to enforce these rules, it would be total chaos because, like we said before, people in Bitcoin are just acting in self-interest. They're not doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. They're motivated by economic incentives. And so these are things that we have to enforce using cryptography. And the cool thing is we have all these wonderful cryptographic primitives that you can use to design cryptocurrencies. So yay, technology. Any questions on that? Okay. So I have another clicker question for you. Cryptographic hash functions are wonderful. We spent a whole 20 minutes on it on lecture 3. And they enable a lot of things in Bitcoin. So which of the following is not something? So most of them are going to be something that is enabled by cryptographic hash functions. So which one is not? Please discuss amongst yourselves. TAs, help them out. Let's get some answers for this.
Where y'all feel it? Let me read the question. It's E. Tell me about it. Yeah, so what about you to make that? Yeah. That's or does someone else have a different idea? Okay, but what about you?
Do you have an answer? Do we need more time? Are we ready? Do we all have an answer? Okay, so I tried to make all the clicker questions very hard today. So I'm not trying to make you feel like you don't know stuff. All of these things are kind of like, if you knew a certain amount, maybe you'll get it wrong, So like the amount that you know kind of it dips a little. So hopefully all of these things look very familiar to you and you're able to apply them to your Bitcoin knowledge. So how many of you think that Merkle trees and tamper evidence and proofs of inclusion are not enabled by cryptographic hash functions? Great. So who remembers what a Merkle tree is? How is it created? Come on, this is an easy question. It's a binary tree? Yes. Mm-hmm. Hashed upwards, yeah. Yeah, so when you're creating the Merkle tree, you need cryptographic hash functions, right? All right, and who thinks that tamper-evident blockchains and hash pointers are not enabled by cryptographic hash functions. Okay, good. So hash pointers are literally a pointer that is the hash of something that it's pointing to. So hopefully you all knew that. And who thinks that validating ownership of funds in transaction scripts is not something that is enabled by cryptographic hash functions? All right, I wanted to get some of you with this. I was hoping some people would pick C. Yeah? Okay, so when we're validating ownership of transaction scripts, so these funds are sent to a certain address, right? And in order to redeem your funds from this address, what do you need to provide? Your public and private key, okay? Just the public key. All right, we'll get to this in a second. You definitely need your private key. All right, but you also need to provide the hash too. Yeah, so if you remember, your Bitcoin address is you use ECDSA to provide the private to public key pair, and then you actually hash that to get the Bitcoin address. Yeah, okay, yeah? No, you use elliptic curve digital signature algorithm, ECDSA. So do you remember that elliptic curve that was like this, and then you like do point multiplication across it? That's not hashing, yeah. It has a lot of the same ideas behind it, so it's like a one-way function, you can't reverse it, but it is not a cryptographic hash function. Yeah. All right, and last one, who thinks that partial pre-image hash puzzle in proof of work is not enabled by cryptographic hash functions? So again, the answer was all the above, yay. Okay, so let's step through each of these so that we can do a little bit of a review section. Today's a very light lecture, if you can't already tell. So we have our Merkle tree, which is our transactions at the bottom, and then we hash them upwards and pair them each. So the parents are always the hash of their two children until we get a Merkle root. And this Merkle root is included in the block header, and it's one of the key things in the block header. And using this Merkle root, as well as all the intermediate hashes, we can actually create a very easy proof of inclusion of a certain transaction within a block. So does anyone remember what are the things that you need to provide? It's literally on the slide. So you have the transaction, the thing that you would hash it with to get that, the thing that you would hash it with to get that, the thing you would hash it with to get the Merkle tree, or the Merkle root, right? So instead of providing all of the data that you would need to reconstruct this Merkle tree, all you have to do is provide one at each level. Does this make sense? So it's a lot easier to have a proof of inclusion. And it's also very easy to tell exactly which transaction was tampered with if one of them is changed, right? Because you would be able to tell exactly which child is different from the block that you have, right? And so that's the beauty of Merkle trees, is it's very easy to prove things are wrong or things are right. All right. And then we have our tamper-evident blockchain due to hash pointers. So does anyone want to like explain this image to me? I talk a lot. Just want to, anyone want to come up here and do the rest of the lecture? It's all stuff that you've seen before. Anyone? Maybe just this slide? Yeah. Yes. So you create a hash pointer by hashing the previous block and pointing to it in your current block, and that gives you a chronological order of the blocks. Exactly. And once something is different, you're able to see that it's propagated throughout the blocks because none of them match up anymore. So you can think of them as puzzle pieces, like I said in the very first lecture when I was trying to abstract things. They're like puzzle pieces. Once one doesn't fit, none of them fit afterwards. So there's no way to like configure it back to make it work. All right. And the third one, which I was hoping to get some of you with, so on the right here, when you generate your private and public key using ECDSA, what you actually do after that is actually apply two cryptographic hash functions to it to get your public key hash. and that's going to be converted into your Bitcoin address. And we do that for extra security, right? So in case something is broken, we have an extra layer of security to make it work. And if you remember when I was going over script during lecture 3, there's actually a place where they're going to ask your public key hash, and then you're going to have your public key and your public key hash, and that's actually your Bitcoin signature, right? So you do need cryptographic hash functions in order to verify ownership of funds. But I was hoping to get some of you with that. Yes. All right. And finally, because of these 3 properties of cryptographic hash functions, we are able to design hash puzzles. So who remembers what pre-image resistance means? Maybe in the terms of the fingerprint and the person, what does pre-image resistance mean? Yes. So I'm just looking for like the basic property of the hash function. Yeah. So property of a cryptographic hash function is pre-image resistance. So given a fingerprint, given a fingerprint, you wouldn't be able to tell me who this fingerprint came from. But you would be able to tell me that 2 fingerprints that are the same come from the same person. But pre-image resistance means you cannot get the pre-image from the image. So given the fingerprint, you can't tell me who it came from. And second pre-image resistance is you have a fingerprint, but you're not going to be able to find another person with the same fingerprint. All right. And then collision resistance is because you have given one, you can't find another, there's no way you're going to find any 2 pairs of people who give you the same fingerprint. Or it's statistically impossible for that to happen. Does this ring any bells? You just wanted to hear me say it. You love listening to me say things because my voice is just great. All right, okay. And so because of these things, we have this avalanche effect, right? So we remember this picture on the right side of Satoshi Nakamoto's, where if you change 1, it's going to change the hash by a lot. So you can't play that hot and cold game where you could kind of guess what the output is going to be. So let's say it's like almost close to where I want it to be, so I just tweak the input a little bit and it'll change the output a little bit. That's not going to happen, right? Because there's a certain degree of deterministic randomness that happens. So you can create hash puzzles with this, right? So when we're creating this proof of work hash puzzle, we make it so that you're blindly throwing darts, right? There's no hot and cold, there's no strategy that you can employ, there's no skill that you can gain. It's always random, and it's just shooting your shots as many as you can, as fast as you can. The more energy you spend, the more likely you're going to get it sooner. And the more ASICs you have, the more blocks you're going to mine, right? And so because of these 3 wonderful properties of cryptographic hash functions, we're able to design a proof of work puzzle. Yes? So off the top of my head, it is a design choice arbitrarily used. What I'm assuming is that you're getting a 256-bit, which is like the length that you wanted, and then it's like provably secure and more secure than others. Like, I'm not Satoshi Nakamoto, so like I don't know why, but those are some properties I would assume are good. Yeah. I mean, Dave, what do you think?
It was really the only waste of time. The alternatives after that year was basically SHA-1, which we've already
Broken.
these 3 things.
Yeah.
So the only other hashes that have been done over there were passive hashes, which don't make any sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're jumping back into proof of stake just for a little bit. But we've talked a lot about like cryptoeconomics and how you can use the economic side of things to design systems with that align incentives, and use also cryptography to secure those incentives, basically. And so first off, we talked a lot about proof of work, but what are some of the drawbacks that proof of work kind of brings, or what we've learned from proof of work? Any hands? Yeah.
It sucks.
It sucks. How does it suck, though?
It's like really inefficient and it takes like a lot of resources.
Yeah, right. This is the main metric that we're looking at when we think about proof of work. We think that it uses up more electricity than Philippines, I think? Or no, more than Austria, less than Philippines. And it also takes longer or more energy to verify than more than like 100,000 user transactions. So that's pretty bad, right? And also one thing that proof of work also brought on unconditionally was the idea of centralization through mining pools, right? So that's another drawback. And so another thing I want to bring up is like the idea of like defender's advantage, actually. So what I mean by this is if I'm like playing a game, if I have a defender's advantage, it just means that it's more advantageous or more beneficial for me to be on the defending side. Or if I have an attacker's advantage, it's the opposite. And so has anybody played the game Risk before? Right? So when you're attacking another army, you have the choice of rolling up to 3 dice. And the defending army has the chance or has the opportunity to roll up to 2. And so that extra dice kind of gives you a higher probability of maybe like wiping out the defending army. So in Risk, we have an idea of like an attacker's advantage. It's just more advantageous to be the attacker normally, right? And so in proof of work, there's no defender's advantage. The cost of attacking and the cost of defending is essentially 1-to-1. There's no benefit to be on the attacking or the defending side because we haven't designed incentives to account for that type of situation. And so constraints are really inflexible. We're dealing with real world things like computation and electricity. And so there's really nothing in place in proof of work that prevents this type of action or like malicious actions in proof of work, and proof of work just simply allows it. So it's if an attacker can amass as many resources as a defender, they will basically overwhelm like that defender, and which isn't a really great situation to be in, and that's why proof of work has a few like disadvantages to that because of this. And so in proof of stake, because we're dealing with things that are like monetary, you can specify properties or define explicitly in the protocol properties that you want to maintain a defender's advantage. So to basically disincentivize actors from doing malicious behavior. So we can introduce the penalties, and we can punish behavior more greatly, or malicious behavior more greatly than in proof of work. And so rather than securing the network by burning energy like in proof of work, we achieve security by locking up capital that people aren't willing to lose in proof of stake. So we discourage malicious behavior with explicit consequences in proof of stake. So that's a bit of the motivations. And so in proof of stake, just like a quick review, proof of stake is the consensus protocol where we use voting power to define how much, or we use your economic stake in the network to determine how much voting power you have. At a very high level, that's what it is. So it's just a quick definition. And so what a 51% attack kind of looks like in both of these networks is, in proof of work, you have to have over 51% of the network's computational power. And so the idea is that, I mean, you can amass a bunch of ASICs to dominate the network using computational power. I mean, the one way that you wouldn't want to try to, you wouldn't want to conduct a 51% attack in the proof of work network is that you basically destroy the system, and the confidence in proof of work or in a proof of work blockchain kind of decreases. But in proof of stake, it's a little bit more difficult to amass 51% of the network stake. It might be more expensive, and we can define explicitly why you wouldn't want to do that. People are disincentivized to attack a network where they have like a majority stake in it. And so proof of stake doesn't necessarily isn't like the greatest consensus algorithm too. It has its drawbacks as well. So we defined in like a little bit in our previous lectures the idea of the rich getting richer basically. So basically, if you have a majority stake in the network, you can always I guess you can reliably get chosen to become the next validator and continue becoming this person that gets richer and richer, gets the mining rewards in this proof of stake system. Dislodging 51% is pretty much impossible in this case because in proof of work, if you want to dislodge a 51% attack, you just have to create more ASICs and just distribute it to the honest majority. But in a proof of stake system, if that person with the majority stake in the network doesn't want to sell their stake, there's really no way to dislodge that 51%. Also, a disadvantage with proof of stake is that because we're locking up or we're staking assets in this network, we have the idea of like a liquidity problem because funds are locked up and that can't be used to transact with. We have like a lower amount of capital that we can actually transact with in a proof of stake system. And also by locking up stake in the network, it decreases supply, and you might argue that it can also increase price of the asset, which is kind of bad. I'm not going to cover the last point. I'll get to that in attacks, actually. Any questions before I move on? So we talked a little bit about attacks or proof of stake. And so what are the attacks that kind of exist in proof of stake? At a naive high level, if we were just to implement proof of stake, these are some of the attacks that might exist if you don't explicitly defend against them. So I'm going to define like the nothing at stake problem. But I'll create an example where I'm making a bet with you. Let's say if you can accurately guess if it's going to rain today, I'll give you $1. And the way that I frame this scenario is that if you give me a correct response, I'll pay you $1, right? So you might think that the payoff matrix looks a little bit like this, right? So if you answer correctly, you'll get $1. If you're clever enough, you might actually realize that if I'm paying for a correct answer, if you answered both true and false, I might actually pay you out $1 in both scenarios, or like in that scenario too. So that's at a high level what the nothing at stake problem is. There's no like consequence of voting for both answer choices, right? And so the idea comes into proof of stake where we come to a fork in the network, right? In a proof of stake network, we realize that if we come across a fork, we have the option to choose like one side of the fork basically. And if it's really easy for us to create blocks in the system, in proof of stake, there's no mining involved, it's all virtual. We can create blocks arbitrarily. If we're selected as the validator, what's to prevent us from just adding a block on either side of the fork? So in the case that fork A ends up winning and that gets chosen as our actual truth of the blockchain, then I'll get the rewards from fork A. If B continues on and becomes the longest chain, we might get the rewards from fork B. And so the thing that we add to like the other side of the fork gets completely ignored. But we can maximize our chances of basically guarantee ourselves a payout, right? So in proof of stake, if validators already know that they can create blocks on multiple competing chains, they'll maximize their reward by basically voting on either side of the chain, right? And so the idea is if we have all our validators or people creating the blocks in our proof of stake system adopting the strategy, we end up with conflicting sides or conflicting forks that we never can converge. We can never reach consensus, and that's really, really bad. So to look at it from another perspective, the reason why this isn't possible in proof of work is because the resource that we're expending in proof of work is computational resources. And if we want to mine on either side of the fork, we actually have to divide up our physical computing power to create a block on one side and creating another block on the other side. So we actually have to physically divide up our computing power and allocate that to creating multiple blocks. In proof of stake, there's no effort that it takes to divide up or like effort to create blocks. So it doesn't cost us any more to create an extra block on either side of the fork. So that's why in proof of stake we have this nothing at stake problem. And so how do we defend against this? So we can introduce an idea called slashing. So this is where we can use like our crypto or like our economic kind of primitives to really design an incentive to prevent malicious behavior. So we can make a rule saying that you're only allowed to vote on one side of the fork. So we can punish those who vote on the wrong side. So if fork A ends up being the one that persists and wins, if you voted on fork B, too bad, you got punished. If you get caught voting on multiple forks, so if you wanted to like be clever and try to vote on both sides, then you also get punished. So rather than having like just rewards in our blockchain system, we introduced penalties to disincentivize malicious behavior. So basically what this looks like is if you voted on the right side of the fork, that ends up being adopted and becomes the truth of the blockchain, you basically get your full reward. But if you vote on the wrong side, you get a negative reward, your funds get slashed. Or if you vote on both sides, that's also considered bad behavior and you also get slashed. And so if I apply that back to my the betting game I had with you, if you voted if you said the wrong answer choice in this like if it's going to rain today kind of example, then I'd take $1 back from you basically if you either vote wrong or if you try to be clever and vote both. Is that, yeah. So, I mean, if you create a block, you know who creates those blocks, and if like I guess the protocol or if people see that one person who's like the validator chosen for that particular round creates 2 different blocks for like different sides of the fork, that can be like a signal or a flag saying that, oh, that's bad behavior, we will slash that validator's funds. Yeah, so you can analyze the blockchain like in rounds or like at particular time intervals, and also we also know who created those blocks also. So it's not like these people were just completely like anonymous, I guess, because at a given round, that validator gets the chance or gets the right to create a block. And so at that point in time, only they can create a block. And if they create multiple blocks, then that's on them. That's their fault. Yeah. Yeah. So validator is so if you think about it in terms of mining, they're the person that bundles the transaction and creates the block. So they get the right to create a block if they get chosen because of how much they stake in the network. So like if they get chosen because like, oh, they staked like 50%, they get a 50% chance to be chosen as a validator. And if they get chosen, then they get the right to produce a block at that next interval in the blockchain. And so what you're asking is like,
actually, I'm asking this in case you validate two different blocks.
mm-hmm.
On a fork.
They don't validate blocks. So the idea is if they ever come across a fork, they can either say, if they ever come across a fork, their choice should be to choose one side of the fork. And if they were to create a block on both ends of the fork, that's considered bad because they're trying to maximize their chances of getting paid out. But yeah, so So okay, so they don't know which side of the block will become the one that ends up being the side of the fork that ends up winning, they don't know that yet. And so that might be arbitrary to like the consensus protocol down the line. So like let's say fork A ends up being the one that wins. They don't know that. So they might have they might think that, oh, fork B has a possibility of winning too. So if I put a block here, I'll get the mining reward if B ends up being the fork that wins, and fork A gets like orphaned. So if they put a block on another side of the fork, it's basically they don't know which side of the fork will win, and so they're trying to guarantee that they'll still get paid out. Because if one side of the fork does get orphaned, they don't get the payout for that like block that they've just created. So they want to maximize their chances of getting a reward. So they will create blocks on either side. And the idea is to punish them for adopting that behavior, because we want the network to come to consensus. And by creating blocks on differing forks or conflicting forks, that's not helping the network come to consensus. Yeah. So I'm not getting into like the idea of uncle blocks actually. That's a little bit more complicated. Or yeah, I'm not. If you want to talk to me afterwards, I can. In Ethereum. So Ethereum doesn't actually use complete proof of stake right now, so they're still using proof of work. So yeah. So the next thing I want to introduce is the idea of a long-range attack. So to define that, it's basically an attacker creates a new branch or a new fork starting from the genesis block. In proof of stake, we realize that it's really easy to create new blocks. It actually takes no effort to do so because there's no inherent mining involved. There's no need to like iterate through different nonces to find a valid block, because all the blocks that you create, as long as you're a validator, those are valid. So the idea is if an attacker starts a new fork, a secret fork, if they create a secret fork that starts all the way from the genesis block, they can try to attempt to take over the main chain and actually rewrite the complete blockchain history. And so two properties that really allow for long-range attacks is that there's also the nothing at stake problem. It costs basically nothing to vote or create a block. It's very easy to create a fork that starts from the genesis block. And also there's the idea of subjectivity. So we have no real way to determine which chain is like the main chain. If we have different forks, if we have like 5 different forks, how do we actually determine which is the correct chain? If like we're a node that just came online again after being offline for like 2 weeks, right? So we have this flawed preconception that this longest chain that we have is the most trustworthy and therefore the most correct one. It's a very it's a safe assumption to make in proof of work, because in proof of work, this longest chain has had the most work done on top of it, and it's kind of provably correct. In proof of stake, there's no idea of work or mining, and so someone on their own can create their own like fork of the blockchain and just keep creating blocks because blocks are very easy to create. And so the idea, or like just an example of what that would look like. So let's say we start off at the genesis block, and Gloria owns like 1% of the tokens. But what she does is like she creates her own fork of the blockchain in secret, and she starts mining on this own secret chain. And so what she can do is just create a bunch of like fake transactions just between herself, and try to create a blockchain that's kind of longer than the existing chain. So since creating blocks doesn't really require any work, she can easily create a large number of blocks in like a very, very short amount of time. And so if this chain ever gets adopted as the truth, she can successfully overwrite the existing history of the blockchain, and that's really bad. So the long-range attack really refers to that this attack can really start from anywhere in the blockchain history. It can start from just one block back, but it can also start all the way back from like the Genesis block, or even for, like, or somewhere in between, right? So I bring up this attack because I want to drive the point home that we have this idea that the longest chain that we have in the blockchain is the most trustworthy one. That's not necessarily the case in proof of stake anymore. So I just want you guys to keep that in mind. I don't have like a particular defense for a long-range attack, but one way, like a hacky way you can do is like, you don't want to accept blocks that are just way too old, because then it might be like a flag of like malicious behavior, something like that. Any questions? Lastly, I want to talk about the idea of stake grinding, actually. So in a proof of stake ecosystem, we want a random way to determine who becomes this next validator, who gets the right to produce a block. And if you become a validator, if you produce a block, you'll get this mining reward, right? We need like you need a somewhat random way to choose these validators, and also do so in a way that's like proportional to the amount that they're staked. And so one way we can do that is we can choose a validator that depends on the previous block signature, something like that, or like even the previous block value. And so the idea of stake grinding is basically, if I get chosen to become a validator, and I know that I need to create, or I get the chance to create a block, and this next validator gets chosen based off of whatever block I produce, what I can do is I can try to grind through different combinations of blocks that might ensure that I'm chosen as the next validator. So as an example, if let's say let's say there's only 2 people that are participating in this voting round of proof of stake, just me and Gloria, we both stake one Bitcoin or something like that. So we all both have 50% chance of being chosen as the next validator. And if we know this protocol rule where like, if let's say our block header starts with like 0 all the way to like 4, we get chosen as this next validator. And if it's like, if the block starts with a 5 all the way to a 9, then we want to choose Gloria as our next block producer, basically. And what I can do is, if I know that protocol rule and I know that that's going to happen, what I can do is I'll try a different combination of blocks. So I'll create a block, and let's say it starts with a 7. If I end up broadcasting that block, I know for sure that like Gloria will get chosen as the next validator, and I don't want that to happen. So I can try another combination for a block, just different transactions or different nonce, and maybe that'll give me a block header that starts with a 3. And once that happens, I broadcast that one, and that guarantees that I'll be chosen as the next validator, and that cycle continues on and on. And so that's the idea of stake grinding. It's bad because it allows people to ensure themselves as this next validator. So what we can do to defend against stake grinding is, we might not want to use like mutable parameters to determine like our randomness for our next validator, right? So if we base our randomness based off of something that we can change, like the transactions that we're including in the block, some sort of arbitrary number like a nonce, that will allow people to brute force through combinations to find a block that ensures them as this next validator. Or we can have like validators stake really well in advance, so they can't actually know when they'll be chosen as a validator. And we might use something where validators have to collaboratively come up with a random value. So unless they all can collude together, this is like a pretty safe scheme. Any questions about stake grinding? So the point that I want to drive home here is that while there's a randomness factor that determines who our next validator is for the blockchain, we don't want that randomness to be determined based off something that we can brute force through. Because once we enable something like stake grinding, it kind of boils down to proof of work, right? We're brute forcing through combinations to find a valid block. Basically, this valid block will ensure that I become the next validator, and that's not particularly good. Any other questions? No, that's not. That's not. Yeah, that's all for today. Yeah. Or are you doing it? Okay.
Yeah, so Algorand is left as an exercise to the reader. So we're hoping that you've learned a little bit about cryptoeconomics and how it's applied to proof of work and proof of stake systems. And so one of our bad people, or two actually, wrote an article about Algorand, which is a proof of stake implementation. They talked about how they applied cryptoeconomics to it, and they found that there wasn't enough incentives to kind of make the design work. So it's not a very long article. It's very easy to understand. If you want, you can also read the Algorand white paper. But if you don't want to read the white paper, you can just read this. And we actually have a white paper circle this weekend where Saroj is going to read the white paper for you and then present it to you in a way that is going to encourage you to answer questions if you don't understand something and discuss, you know, maybe there isn't enough incentives, maybe the design is not quite there. The whole idea is to encourage discussion. So you're all invited. It is on Saturday at 12:30 p.m. at Skydeck, which is on Shattuck. So definitely check that out. It's also on Facebook if you want to get the event details. Definitely come to that. It's going to be cool. Yeah, and this is the attendance link. Stick around for discussion.